Hello, everyone. I'm giving it another minute or so to see if we have any more additions to our meeting today. This is going to be a fun one. We're going to talk about contracts in a fun way. Imagine that. Who could ever think of talking about contracts in a fun way? I like the way you think, Irvin. Well, let's get started and I'm sure we'll have some additions. I'm going to kind of assume for the sake of this meeting that everyone participating is a little newer. So if you've had more experience in the business, bear with us because I'm trying to make sure that what we talk about is something that's going to be meaningful to everyone. And so I don't want to talk about contracts at a level that some individuals in the room feel that they're, not getting clarity. So I know in boot camp, Lisa goes over the contract in detail, field by field. And so my game plan for today, and if anybody has specific questions, let me just say you can put a message in the chat or unmute yourself and kind of wave your hand at me or something, and I'm happy to answer the questions. But I thought for today, instead of just literally going line by line through the contract again, that I would go through and hit the lines that I think are more prone for hiccups and give you a chance to kind of learn from some stories that I can share with you and so that you understand the why. For me, I'm much more likely to do what I'm asked to do on a form if I understand why it has to be done that way. I've always been that way. If you just tell me don't do something, I'm like, well, why not? Tell me why not? I like it that way, right? So that's why I'm going to take that approach today, and I hope it's helpful. So if we start with line 1, I recently had the question again is broker. And by the way, let me stop and introduce myself for anybody that doesn't know me. I'm Pam Douberly. I am the broker liaison in the Bel Air office, the Largo office. I'm also a productivity coach. I've been with Keller Williams and in the business over 18 years. I'm in my 19th year and I love it. I love selling real estate. I love helping people. I love the fact that every day is a new adventure and no two deals are the same. So that's what keeps life interesting for me all the time. So with that said, when I reference the way things were back in a point in time, I'm thinking about some of the eras of the market that I've been through. But I'd like to begin with just talking about line 1. Line 1 is where the name of the seller goes. And every once in a while, someone will come and ask me, why can't I just put owner of record on there? And the reason that our broker won't allow it, and the reason that we can't is if I were to say, I am the buyer and I'm upset and I want to sue, or I want to notify the seller about something, who is owner of record? I've never met a person named owner of record. So we can't use that. We have to be specific on that line about seller so that we identify, and on the buyer line, so that we identify who the real players are. So this is a legal document. It's a legal agreement. And so we have to have clarity there. On line number 2, we talk about the buyer. And whenever I meet a buyer and I need to fill in line number 2, I ask them what's their legal name, because it's best to put legal name there. And quite often, I end up having to say, what's on your driver's license? So for me, my name is Pam Douberly, and yet that's what I go by, but my true legal name is Pamela. So when it comes to contracts and ownership of property and things, it's Pamela and not Pam. And so that's another important thing to know. When we move on down to lines 7, 8, 9, I'm going to kind of talk about those as a collection. If you notice, because I didn't notice it in the beginning, on line 7, The contract specifically says street address, city, and zip. And not too long after I got going with the Ubaldini group, I've been working with the Ubaldini group for about 10 years, I think. I had a contract sent back to me from compliance because I didn't put the zip code on there. And I was like, what, zip code? Oh my goodness. And yet it was pointed out to me on line 7, the form specifically says street address, city, and zip. So we need to complete that line, including zip code. Line 8, we're going to put the county in. And then tax ID number, let's talk about that for a minute. I want to share something really important about the tax ID number. And let me see what's coming up in the chat here. So somebody's asking, am I going to show it? I think I have the contract shared. Are you not able to see it? Is it showing up on your screen?
It's actually just showing your file, but not the actual contract.
Oh, so I have the actual contract on my screen. So let me see.
You just have to share.
I'm glad somebody spoke up
screen.
about that. This says I'm sharing my screen, but I'm going to stop and I'm going to try it again. Let me see if I can get it out there now. So thanks for pointing it out. Can you see it now? The as-is contract?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. So this Zoom technology stuff, I'm still becoming like a real Zoom wizard. So one day I'm going to just be super duper at it. So thanks for helping me. So we talked about lines 1 and 2, seller and buyer, and we talked about line 7. As you can see, right here, the contract actually says on line 7, street address, city, and zip. Then on line 8, located in Pinellas County or whatever the county is. And then there's the property tax ID piece of it. And what I want to point out about that is several years ago, could be 10 or 12 now, I've lost track of time. There was a situation that came up that actually was in the newspaper or something, so that you understand the value of this tax ID number and the importance of verifying it. There was an agent apparently who sold a property towards Brooksville area somewhere in Florida, more rural, definitely very rural. And there was a vacant lot. There were effectively two vacant lots side by side, but one had a mobile home on it. And the tax ID numbers, the buyer thought they were buying the property that had the mobile home on it. The buyers did. The agent put the wrong tax ID number on the contract. The contract ended up with the tax ID number of the property next door. And I'm not sure that the agent, I don't know whether it came from MLS or what. So I'm not here judging or stating an absolute fact about how it happened. But anyway, the tax ID number ended up wrong on the contract. And the process went all the way through title and through closing. And although buyer thought they bought the vacant land with the mobile on it, the property that was actually for sale, in fact, I think it was in MLS's way, was the vacant land next door. Buyers went to the mobile home after closing and moved in. They had to get a locksmith out there to unlock the mobile, but they moved in and everything. And several months later, the owners of the mobile home showed up and went, "What are you doing here? This is our mobile." And the bottom line is it came out that the property they thought they bought and the property they actually bought were two different things. So the point of all of that is I've always been taught and told that property tax ID number on line number 8 is the most critical element you could put on this contract in identifying the property. So even though the tax ID number is in MLS, I do my best to remember to go back and look at the actual tax record on the property appraiser's website and double check that tax ID number to make sure that it matches. And I know that our MLS system helps pull it in and everything, and yet it doesn't hurt to take 10 seconds and double check something. So if you're going to choose something to double check, pick that, because that's important. Line 9 is the legal description, of course. Just a reminder here on starting on line 15 through line 19. That's the list of items, the list of items that are included with the sale. And I would strongly encourage you, whether you're on the buyer side or the seller side, when an offer is presented, review this list with either side to make sure they understand what's included and what's not listed. So when you're on the buyer side, let's just recognize it says ranges and ovens, refrigerators, dishwashers, disposal, ceiling fans, intercom, light fixtures, drapery rods and draperies, blinds, window treatment, smoke detectors, garage door openers, security gate, and other access devices, and storm shutters, assuming they existed on the property as of the date of the initial offer. So when you're on the buyer side, I encourage you to think back, go back and look in the MLS listing, look at the photos. And more importantly, what I try to do when I'm showing a property is make note of things that are outside that list that need to go on the contract, particularly if the buyer seems to have an interest in it. So for instance, washer and dryer is not on that list. The MLS listing might say that, but if you don't get it also in the contract, seller is not obligated to leave the washer and dryer. If there's a pool equipment, I always put pool equipment and pool sweep on there. If there's a shed in the backyard, add the shed. Let me think about other things. There was a time when I sold a house, this was probably, I don't know, 12 or 14 years ago. I sold a house, and in the bedroom, right above, along the ceiling, about, I don't know, 12 inches down from the ceiling, there was about a 6-inch wide clear glass shelf all the way around that bedroom. And buyers went in there with me, and the buyer said, "Oh, this is perfect," because they had a collection of baseballs in the little plastic cases, and they were so excited that that shelf was in there in just the right spot that they could put all their baseballs in there. So that shelving needed to go in here on line 20 and 21. And that I put it in there, the shelving in the front bedroom or whatever you can use to be specific about it, to be sure that it gets left. Anything that can be picked up. There was a time when I showed a property and buyer ended up buying it. And when she walked out, we walked out onto the back and it was gorgeous. The patio area was beautiful. It was all these terracotta pavers. And there was a terracotta bird bath right in the middle of this paver patio. And when the buyer walked out there, buyer said, "Oh, don't you love this bird bath? This patio is gorgeous." So that bird bath was something someone could easily pick up and carry off with them and say, you know, it was just like a flower pot. We took it with us. That ended up on line 20 and 21 because clearly with the buyer's reaction, the buyer, without directly saying it, I knew was expecting that that was going to stay. So when you're showing a property, keep your ears open, watch for verbal indications and, you know, behaviors that tell you buyer is really excited about something. And so they're assuming that it's staying. So a couple of other things to put on your list that have been issues, the wall mirrors in the bathrooms. You know, more and more now people are putting up these framed mirrors that are more like decorator mirrors. And we've had instances where sellers have taken them with them. And their argument is, it's no different than a picture hanging on the wall. Why are you upset about that, right? Buyers tend to assume that every bathroom comes with a mirror. Surely there's a mirror with it. So clarity is power, put it on the list. So write that down as something you want to remember. Another thing that's come up multiple times that's kind of like you can't win no matter which way it goes is TV mounts. So there are times, unless you check with the buyer, I've had situations where the seller took the TV and the TV mount and left kind of a poor patch job on the wall of patching up the holes from it. And buyer has walked in at final walkthrough and said, "Look at that. They even took the TV mount off the wall. And left this mess on the wall for me to clean up." I've had other times when I've done a final walkthrough without getting clarity on it and had buyer say that where the seller left the TV mount and buyer says, "Well, gee whiz, you know, the least they could have done is taken the TV mount down. So look at that. They left that for me to deal with. You know, how rude is that?" So part of the purpose in this section is to provide clarity for both parties to understand what the expectations are. So I point those things out because it's important for you to know. And then, you know, you have this as leverage with the seller. You're going to go over this with the seller to make sure the seller does understand that the buyer's expecting the washer and the dryer and the bird bath to stay. I had one seller one time move to Melbourne. he knew the refrigerator was in the list, and I'm going to come back to this chat here in just a minute. He knew the refrigerator was in the list. Buyer did the final walkthrough. I was on the listing side. I get the call. The walkthrough was the night before. The buyer's agent calls and says, Pam, where's the refrigerator? I said, what do you mean? It's in the kitchen. She said, not anymore. And it was a beautiful stainless steel side by side, oversized refrigerator. It was beautiful. And so I called the seller up, and he'd already moved to Melbourne. And I said, where's the refrigerator? He said, I decided I'm not going to leave it. I'm just not going to leave it. I'm taking it with me. I said, well, where is it? He said, it's over here in Melbourne with me now. I said, well, the contract said you have to leave a refrigerator. What are we going to do? He said, I don't know. So we ended up with him. I went and found another one that was as similar as I could find it. And we ended up putting it on a credit card to get through closing and got it delivered before closing. So that information is important. And then, of course, if there's something to be excluded from the purchase, you're going to want to get that recorded on line 23 and 24. And better yet, if a seller doesn't plan to leave something on the house, then if they will just get rid of it before closing, it's even better. I had a situation where there was a home that I sold over kind of towards Riverview area. And there was the sellers had a really cool chandelier, very country looking chandelier hanging over their dining room table, kind of in their kitchen. And they told me from the get-go that that was not going to go. And I told them repeatedly they needed to remove it and replace it with something else. So we let everybody know about that. And as we approached closing, buyers came back and said they wanted to see what they were going to replace it with. And so seller went and bought like a $10 light fixture, no real chandelier, and put it up there. And buyers pushed back, and seller ended up saying, well, I tell you what, tell the buyers to go pick something out and I'll pay for it. So the buyers went and picked out a $400 chandelier to hang over this kitchen table. So, you know, at that point, the seller was really upset that he was having to spend that much money. But if he'd gotten the thing out and hung something else up there before we started showing the property, we would never have had that problem. So, you know, again, clarity is power, and better for them to, for us to know that up front. So now let me see if I can check. I saw something in the chat here. I want to just stop and respond to that. So yeah, Irvin said, I always ask the buyers what they want as soon as they let me know that they want to submit an offer. Curtain rods and lawn equipment. Lawn equipment is another one. If the buyer thinks it's going to stay, yep. Yeah, exactly. Good suggestion. All right. So then, you know, on this paragraph number 2, as we move into that, this whole section, we want figures, numbers, not words. And what I mean by that is we're going to start off with on line 26 with the purchase price, and on line 27, we're going to put the deposit. Line 38, it can be a percentage or a loan amount. And then line 41 needs to either be the mathematical remaining number for a balance, not the word balance, but the number, or it can be, let's imagine the financing is 90% financing. So you could alternatively put 10% as the balance on line 41, 10% minus the $2,000 escrow deposit, assuming that's what the escrow was at the top. So that's acceptable practice too. Just a reminder, lines 32 to 34, it's not okay to fill that in completely. It's absolutely not okay to put TBD for the title company. You need to put the title company, the address, and at least the phone number. And that's now a FREC violation with a fine. So make sure that you fill that out completely. And then on line 45, time for acceptance, I generally allow 48 hours, about 48 hours for a response. And as long as you get a response of some sort, even if it's an email or something, within that period of time, that date does not have to be changed. This contract says on line 46, unless otherwise stated, time for acceptance of any counteroffers. So the response at a minimum is a counteroffer. Acceptance of any counteroffers shall be within 2 days after the day the counteroffer is delivered. So as long as you get through the process of negotiation and get it signed within 2 days after the date on line 45, you're good. And then lastly, on line 52, I just want to strongly encourage you, when you can, as much as possible, if buyers getting financing, ask the loan officer, when should the closing be? How long do they need to do the closing? Because they're going to be the main path. That's the main path to getting the deal closed. So can they close in 30 days? If you put a 20-day closing or 25-day closing on this agreement and the lender can't get it done in that period of time, you're just kidding. It's just a joke. You've got to put a reasonable amount of time out there. So the best practice would be to talk to that lender, loan officer, before you start showing property and ask questions to include, so generally, how quickly can your organization close this loan? So that then you're prepared and you know upfront. So I'm going to pause for just a minute here and ask if anyone has any questions. And before I go any further with that, I just want to point out, I always feel comforted by the fact that this is a 12-page contract, and yet we only fill in pages 1 through 5 and 11 and 12. So look at that. We're halfway through already. We just got started. So if you've got a question, let me know here in the chat and I'll try to answer it. If not, we'll go on to the next page. All right. And by the way, on line 45 there, time for acceptance, I typically put a time of day also, because time of day is confusing, I think, a little bit on this contract. So if today is Thursday, if I allowed through Saturday for a response, for instance, I would put Saturday's date, which is going to be June 27th, 11:59 p.m. to make it perfectly clear that that's the window of time that we want a response in. All right, so you're going to get the document initialed. Just a reminder, paragraph 5, allows for extension of the closing date for if there are issues with the buyer getting financing. That Consumer Financial Protection Bureau closing disclosure, that delivery is required. And if there's a delay in getting that out, we may end up extending. And then on line 58, if there's a force majeure, we may decide to extend. And from what I understand, COVID, from what I've been told, COVID as we know it is not included in the definition of force majeure on this current contract. So it'll be interesting what comes out in future contracts. Paragraph number 6. Oh, this is a fun one. I want to point out, so that this jumps out at you when you look at this page going forward, letter 6B, put a circle around it or something if you have it on your paper, or put a star on it if you're making notes. Number 6B, line 68, if there is a tenant in the property or there's some kind of arrangement for to allow someone to continue to stay there, letter B needs to be checked. And here's what's really important about that. The seller has some responsibilities. If you notice in that paragraph, it says, if the property is subject to a lease after closing or is intended to be rented or occupied by third parties beyond closing, the facts and terms thereof shall be disclosed in writing by the seller to the buyer, and copies of the written leases shall be delivered to buyer all within 5 days after the effective date. This is the only place in the contract that talks about that. So when you don't check that box, the obligation for the seller to provide a copy of the lease to the buyer is not defined. And so it gets all gray and ugly at that point, because buyer needs to know what the lease terms are if there is a tenant there, so that the buyer knows what they're committing to. Because in Florida, the lease takes precedence over the sale. So if a property is leased and there's a formal lease with an end date, what is this, June. So maybe the end date is November. If a buyer buys that property today, they are obligated to support that lease and allow those tenants to stay there through November. Now they can, that buyer can go in and talk with the tenant and potentially come to some agreement with the tenant that maybe the tenant is going to move out early. The buyer can offer out the tenant some incentive, like, I tell you what, I really am wondering if you would give any consideration to moving out early, because if you would, once I buy it, I'll let you stay here for a month at only half rent or something like that, while you work on getting moved out. But you can't make them move out. Cannot make them move out. And by the way, let me just say in general, in case you didn't know, in Florida, you cannot evict someone that's living on someone else's property without a lease. There has to be a lease with money on it, with an amount on it. So we really need to be careful. This paragraph towards the end talks about post-occupancy by the seller. And we want to run from that. We really want to run from that, because when a seller says, oh, sure, yeah. Or when the buyer says, sure, you want to stay there an extra week, it's fine. Particularly at any time, but today, especially with the uncertainty about employment and things that some people are dealing with. What if the seller stays there for a week and loses his job? And then with the loss of his job, he can't get a rental somewhere else because the landlords won't approve him because he doesn't have a job. And now the seller says, I'm so sorry. I know I sold my house to you. I know I told you I'd be out by the end of June, but can you just give me another month? I need another month. Now I'm going to have to find a job. Then I'm going to have to find a place to stay. And oh, by the way, now we have a mandate in Florida right now. You can't even evict somebody that you have a lease. So look at what a pickle that can become. What a complicated pickle it can become if you let that happen. So we strongly discourage you supporting and putting together a deal where the seller is going to stay after closing or the buyer is going to move in before closing. What if the buyer moved? And we have had a situation similar, but not quite the same in our office, where buyer didn't move in, but within the week after loan approval and before closing, buyer lost their job. So buyer couldn't get financing anymore because whatever company buyer was working for decided to close their doors as a result of COVID and everything. So we just really strongly discourage it. Homeowners insurance gets really muddled up. It's just ugly. I just can't even say that enough. So I've got a message here from Irvin. Yeah, don't even let the buyer put their personal items on the house before closing. Yeah, exactly. Thank you for that. That's exactly right. Because if they put their stuff in the garage and it gets stolen, or it's not inventoried, and so buyer swears they put that 70-inch TV in the garage, and now they go to move in and it's gone. And they're like, so where did my 70-inch TV go? I mean, it was brand new. I've only owned it like a month. And now it's disappeared. Like, did the seller take it? Who took my TV? Or there's a fire and it all gets burned down. Whose insurance company is going to pay for it? Because the insurance company for the seller is going to say, we're protecting the seller's property. There's nothing in here that says we're going to protect the buyer's property. And so it's just really complicated. So just don't go there. I've helped people find ways to camp out in an RV, to rent an RV, to camp out at Fort DeSoto Park, to camp out at, what's the one out by Bay Pines? I can't think of the campground. There's a campground over there right now. To camp at the campground. They've gone to Disney for a week and spent a week at Disney. I mean, extended stay hotels are still around and they work great too. So just know those options are there. All right. So let's see what we got here in the chat before I move on. Oh, KOA. Yeah, thank you. My mind went blank for a minute. Yeah, the KOA campground. So financing. Let's talk about financing a little bit. And I want to talk about the loan approval date a little bit, because I want to tell you about an ugly thing that happened for me and I hope I can help it prevent it from happening for you. So of course we can always choose 8A, which is cash. And I love doing cash deals. They're just so wonderful sometimes. However, with a cash deal, let me just say, don't lose sight of the fact that you need proof of funds. You absolutely need proof of funds. I recently had a buyer who repeatedly assured me that I didn't need to worry about that. She was going to be buying cash because she had a partner, somebody that she had worked with in the past that was going to help her out and was going to provide the money. And so I repeatedly said, well, can you get that person to give us a bank statement? I mean, we're going to need something when we make your offer. And we got down to the point that I finally got on the phone with that person and said, you know, I need a copy of your bank statement. And that person said, I'm not going to provide it. He said, this person said, let me just tell you, I don't even know that I'm really going to do this. And I said, okay, that's all I needed to know. So I went back to buyer and I said, you know, I didn't want to, I was told that confidentially, so I couldn't really tell the buyer all the details, but I did go back to her and say, I just want to let you know that I had the conversation with this person that's going to support you. They're not willing to provide any documentation. And without that, we really cannot move forward with this as a cash sale. So we need to look at alternatives. And so now we ended up working with financing and getting financing instead because there was no documentation. So here's what I want to talk about though, that's really important. In 8B, I want to talk about loan approval. And let me point out a couple of things because I had a deal fall apart over loan approval. And I was very lucky, very blessed that it didn't blow up and wind up in a real legal mess. So on line 86, you see it says, this contract is contingent upon buyer obtaining approval of a whatever type of loan. Line 87 says within blank number of days. And that blank number of days is the period of time for the loan approval. That's the loan approval period. So number one, we don't want that period of time to be longer than the closing date. So step number one is if you've got a 30-day closing, the number that goes in that blank needs to be less than 30 days, 25-ish or something, 26 at least, or less. And then it goes on to say they're going to obtain approval of a loan within that period of time. And on line 88, it says for a fixed, adjustable, or fixed or adjustable rate. In the loan amount, do you see that loan amount? And in parentheses, it says, see paragraph 2C. So I'm going to take you back to paragraph 2C here for just a minute. So when I look on line 38, paragraph 2C, there's a financing amount put in there, right? So let me finish the sentence and I'm gonna tell you what happened for me. Where did that go here? Okay, line 88. Line 89, at an initial interest rate not to exceed, and I always leave that blank for the then prevailing rate, and for a term of 30 years. So we're gonna talk more about the loan approval, but the day came on a deal that I had. I was on the buyer side, loan approval was due today. And my first clue should have been the 4 phone calls I got from the listing agent all day long. Where's your loan approval? It's due today. When are you gonna have me loan approval? When are you gonna have it? So I hounded the loan officer. It showed up in my email at 4 o'clock. The other agent, even though this contract actually goes to midnight, the other agent just was bugging me so much about that they had to have it before 5. As soon as I got it, I just, boom, sent it right over to her because I thought, oh, hallelujah, I got this. Well, here's what I didn't know. The seller had another offer, backup offer for $10,000 more than the deal we had on the table. The seller had an attorney and they were waiting for one little shoe to drop on the deal, for me to miss one little thing. And as it turned out, that loan approval letter, remember how up here on line 88, it references in the loan amount, see paragraph 2C, that it's supposed to match? Unbeknownst to me, the buyer had talked with the lender, and originally we put it together that the buyer was getting 90% financing. And the buyer, by talking to the lender, 90, I think it was 90, buyer decided to get 80 or 85% financing instead. So the financing amount on the loan approval letter did not match what was on the front of the contract. So the attorney argued we did not have loan approval per the contract. And so within 5 minutes of me sending it over, they sent over a release and cancellation form from the seller. I called the legal hotline. I called Nikki at that time, because Nikki was the broker, and said, you know, what can I do? There was nothing we could do. And so that killed that deal. It was less than a week from closing, and the whole thing just got slammed right there because we did not deliver loan approval to match in the time frame required. We did meet the time frame required, but the amounts didn't match what was shown in paragraph 2. So I point that out to you because fortunately for me, where I was blessed is the buyer was an investor kind of guy. And he said, you know what, Pam, who cares? It's fine. I'll just go buy something else. So luckily he moved off. He moved on without any grief. But I often thought back about it and I thought, boy, that could have kind of turned into a mess. Not that I deliberately made a mistake. I had no idea that he had decided to change his financing, but I didn't have a strong sense of awareness that that stipulation was in the contract and that could happen. So I share that with you because back in the day, earlier in my years of real estate, anytime a buyer put more money down and their loan amount was lower, we all thought, wow, that's a stronger deal. Buyers putting more money into it. They're very committed. That's a good sign. But this contract, this is the first time I've ever seen it in all the contracts I've seen. In this version, that's an important element. So just know at a minimum to stay tuned with your buyer. And if buyer does decide to make an adjustment in the amount that they borrow, an addendum or something is going to be needed to make an adjustment to that amount in paragraph 2. So just beware because that just was ugly. So I want to bring you on down here to let me just get down here to the loan approval. So on line 99, it says buyer shall keep seller and broker fully informed about the status of buyer's mortgage loan application. So let me point that out because often I hear from agents who say, I'm on the listing side. I have no idea what's going on with the buyer's loan and no one will talk to me. This paragraph, line 99 says, buyer shall keep seller and broker fully informed about the status of buyer's mortgage loan application, loan approval, and loan processing, and authorizes buyer's mortgage broker, lender, and closing agent to disclose such status and progress and release preliminary and finally executed closing disclosures and settlement statements to the seller and the broker. So when that comes up, this is the paragraph to point out to the loan officer to say, the buyer signed the contract. The buyer authorized you, because sometimes they'll say, we can't talk to you. Buyer authorized you right here on lines 99 to 102 to talk to me. Now, sometimes they still won't do it. Sometimes they'll argue their privacy guidelines won't allow them within their bank. And yet that is the authorization. Now, on line 103, it says, upon buyer obtaining loan approval, buyer shall promptly deliver written notice of such approval to seller. I want you to know, I just learned recently, it does not have to be a formal loan approval letter. It can simply be, this doesn't say it has to be a formal letter. This just says on line 103, upon buyer obtaining approval, loan approval, it can be an email from the loan officer that says, by the way, we got loan approval today, we're good. It can be as simple as that. In fact, when I think back about the situation I just told you about with the amounts and all, it would be a gift to just have an email without the detail on it. So an email, it satisfies that requirement even. And on line 104, it says, if buyer is unable to obtain loan approval after the exercise of diligent effort, then at any time prior to the expiration of the loan approval period, buyer may provide written notice to seller stating that buyer has been unable to obtain loan approval and has either elected to waive loan approval, in which event then the contract will continue as if loan approval was obtained, or terminate the contract. So the other key piece of that for you to understand is that loan approval date, you need to mark it on your calendar and circle it in red and count back a day or two to be verifying this, because after that loan approval date passes, the buyer really doesn't have leverage to cancel over financing. So that's a really important date. So when we go on to look at this last little bit here about it, line 109 says, if buyer fails to timely deliver either the notice that they got approval or that they're terminating to seller prior to expiration of the loan approval period, then loan approval shall be deemed waived, in which event this contract will continue as if loan approval had been obtained provided, however, seller may elect to terminate this contract by delivering written notice to buyer within 3 days after expiration of the loan approval period. So just know, this is the only contract I've ever seen that has this. This is another little pitfall. Once that loan approval date hits, if buyer hasn't delivered loan approval to the seller has 3 days that they can cancel this contract. And the sad truth about that is, if you did have a 30-day contract and your loan approval was day 25, chances are the buyer's already got all their stuff packed up and getting ready to move. They've already given notice on their lease. They're already 1 foot in the door into their new house. And here's the seller going, nope, per the contract, we're canceling. We're going to cancel. You didn't deliver what you were supposed to deliver. So seller could elect to terminate the contract. And then on 113, if this contract is timely terminated and buyer is not in default under the terms of this contract, then buyer does get their deposit back. On line 116, if loan approval has been obtained or deemed to have been obtained and buyer fails to close, so here we go. Now we're between day 25 and day 30 and buyer doesn't actually close on the contract. Then the deposit shall be paid to the seller, unless failure to close is due to seller's default or inability to do what they're supposed to do in this contract, or property-related conditions of the loan approval have not been met, such as if the lender is requiring some other special property-related condition, like a code enforcement lien has to be cleared or something like that. Or thirdly, the appraisal of the property obtained by the buyer's lender is insufficient to meet the terms of the loan approval. So if the property doesn't appraise, those are the only reasons. So once that loan approval date passes, unless you can justify it with one of those, if the buyer doesn't close at a minimum, if the deal doesn't close at a minimum, the seller keeps the deposit. So I can't emphasize enough the need to be acutely aware of that deadline in this contract. Then we look at paragraph 9 for closing costs. This is pretty standard language about who's going to pay what as far as the closing is concerned. The one thing I like to do out of courtesy is on line 131 over to the right is the word other. And if the seller is going to contribute to buyer's closing costs at all, after other, that language is really going to be in paragraph 20. And in here, I'm going to add see paragraph 20. And that's just a professional courtesy to point out that there is language later to review. And years ago, it was kind of a game that agents would play. And I'm sorry to say it because it isn't very high integrity at all, but in very fine print. So you still want to watch for it. In very fine print in that blank right there, agents would put seller agrees to pay 3% or contribute 3% of price towards buyer's closing costs. And if you were not paying attention and buyer signed or seller signed the contract, you just committed the seller to paying buyer's closing costs and they didn't even know it. So watch out for that. I don't see it happening as much anymore, but for a while that seemed like kind of a game we played as agents and it just wasn't very professional. I think everyone's probably aware, so I'm not going to belabor the point that lines 158 and 162 indicates who's going to choose the title company, the closing agent, and pay for owner's policy. And if you're not aware, owner's policy generally costs the seller about $1,500 to $2,000. So I tell buyers, you know, unless you've got a title company that you're just overly passionate about, let the seller choose the title company and let them pay the $1,500 to $2,000. There's not that much difference in fees between title companies, generally speaking. The title insurance fees are promulgated. They're managed by the government. There's not a whole lot of opportunity to deviate there. Sometimes the closing fees themselves can vary a little bit, but it does help the buyer save about $1,500, $2,000 usually. All right, so when we move on to page number 4, look at that. Look how far we are through this contract already. How about that? We're going to skip, you know, the Miami-Dade part. Survey on line 170. just notice that the true deadline on the contract, if anybody held your feet to the fire, notice that it says on or before the title evidence deadline, buyer may at buyer's expense have the property surveyed and certified by a registered Florida surveyor. If seller has a survey covering the real property, a copy shall be furnished to the buyer and closing agent within 5 days after the effective date. So there's some deadlines in there that get overlooked. So I'm going to scroll back here, try not to make you dizzy, back to line 145. That's the title evidence deadline. And the default is that 15 days prior to closing is what that means. 15 days goes in there if buyer is getting financing. Typically 5 days goes in if it's cash. But now let's just think about that. If you have a 30-day closing and title evidence, the title commitment is due 15 days before closing, you're looking at like day 14 or 15 for that to show up. And that means per this paragraph on line 170 that the survey needs to be done by then too. And in practice, what happens more often is buyer wants to do their inspections. Sometimes they have 15 days for inspections before they order. They want to get that done before they order the appraisal and before they order the survey. So a suggestion would be, even if you're getting financing, to potentially on line 145, maybe make that 10 days before closing to allow a little more time to get that survey ordered. And then when you look at the survey, the deadline, here from the seller side, every once in a while I'll have a seller who says, I'm not giving them a survey. Tell the buyer to buy their own survey. And yet the contract says when the seller signs it on line 171, if the seller has a survey covering the property, a copy shall be furnished to the buyer and the closing agent, the title company, within 5 days after the effective date. So that's another deadline that the seller's feet could be held to the fire for not delivering it. So know that that needs to be done. Now, typically title companies, if the survey is more than about 10 years old, they won't allow that. They're going to require that a new survey be done. Or if the survey, if the buyer has added on to the house, or they've added a fence, or they've added a shed that wouldn't be reflected on that survey, title's going to require that a new survey be ordered as well. On line 173, that's where we indicate home warranty. And one word of warning there, if buyer is asking the seller to provide a home warranty on line 174, make sure that you put the name of the home warranty company that the buyer prefers and the program. So if it's a 210 home warranty, the premium, I don't remember what it is, Supreme, let's call it plan, then you're going to put 210 home warranty Supreme plan or premium plan or whatever they call it, at a cost not to exceed whatever their cost is, $400, $500. Because here's what happens. This is a true story. An agent put this together and said, buyer shall, or seller shall pay for a home warranty plan issued by a home warranty company at a cost not to exceed $500. So that seller researched out on the internet and found a home warranty company that barely covered anything for like $125 or $150. And buyer was really upset at closing to discover that's what kind of home warranty they got. And yet the seller was like, hey, you said for me to find a home warranty company. I did. You said keep the cost under $500. I did. So what's your gripe? So you need to be specific there. You can put a home warranty plan issued by a home warranty company of buyer's choice, or a home warranty company and plan of buyer's choice at a cost not to exceed $500, for instance, or $400. And then do your homework after you're under contract and determine that, at which point, when that's decided, then you're going to do an amendment or an addendum to the contract to say seller agrees to purchase the home warranty from 210 Home Warranty or First American Home Warranty or whatever company it is. All right, so if we take a look next at special assessments, just a reminder, these special assessments are municipal special assessments. They have nothing to do with the condo association, nothing to do with the condo association or homeowners association. And it specifically says that here on line 177 and 78. Seller shall pay the full amount of liens imposed by a public body And in parentheses, it says public body does not include a condominium or homeowners association that are certified, confirmed, and ratified. So line 183, seller's going to pay the installments due before closing and buyer after, or line 185, the seller is to pay them in full. So now on line, starting on line 190, we get into a whole group of disclosures. So what I think I'm going to do with this section that I think will be helpful is I'm going to go over this part like I would if you were a buyer, if I were reviewing this contract with you, because I'm not going to read all this to the buyer. It's way too much. They would fall asleep and I wouldn't blame them. So instead I'm going to say, okay, Ms. Buyer, these next couple of pages really cover disclosures, and I want to go over them with you really quickly, generally what they say. First of all, radon gas is a naturally occurring event, and if you're concerned about radon gas, you certainly have the right to have it tested. Permits, the seller, if there's any issues with permits, the seller should have disclosed that to us in writing. If the seller, on line 197, if the seller identifies permits which have not been properly closed or improvements which were not permitted, then seller shall promptly deliver to buyer all plans, written documentation, or other information regarding those permits. Be aware though, agents, the seller is not required to pay for getting that permit replaced. Mold is a naturally occurring event, Mr. Buyer, and so if you're concerned about that, you can certainly have an inspection. Flood zone, elevation certificate, this just makes you aware that when it comes to flood zones and getting flood insurance, they're gonna look at the lowest floor elevation in the property. And so I would encourage you during the home inspection period, or during the home inspection period, let's check into your insurance and let's see what we can do about flood insurance if it's needed. And I generally do try to look back at the indicators that we have on flood insurance up front. And if I have the time on the front end, I will call a representative from Florida Best Quote and have them give me a quote for insurance while I'm writing the offer. If I can get that, I'll get it. And I'll verify with them is the property in a flood zone, because I would rather double check it with them than not. Line 217, the energy efficiency brochure, buyer acknowledges receipt. That's why we give them one right there. Line 219, I'll say to buyer, if this house was built before 1978, I'll be giving you a lead-based paint disclosure. Line 221, if there's a homeowners association, you're going to need to review any disclosures associated with that. Line 224, just want you to know property taxes can change. They often do. With a change of ownership, I don't control them. I'm just making you aware that that could happen. It could trigger reassessment of the property, and that could result in higher taxes. Paragraph 230 talks a little bit about FERPTA, and I think there's another section that talks about it also. So remember, anyone who's not a U.S. citizen comes under the FERPTA, Tax Act, which is really from the IRS and basically are associated with the IRS. And it allows them to collect income tax from the foreign seller at closing. The title company is going to take care of that. So we used to be required to add a FERPTA rider to the contract, but not anymore because the language is in the contract now. So it says the seller shall inform buyer in writing if the seller is a foreign person. So if you have a listing and the seller is a foreign person, in special terms, add a note that says, seller is a foreign person and is subject to FERPTA. Buyer and seller shall comply with FERPTA, which may require seller to provide additional cash at closing. So, and FERPTA is a kind of a whole nother day's class, really. Seller's disclosure, again, seller doesn't know of anything else that materially affects the value of the property. Paragraph 11 on 245, the seller is to continue to maintain the property. Sometimes they don't feel like it anymore and they quit mowing the yard. The pool goes green. It's just a hot mess, but the contract says they're going to do it. Paragraph 12, this is the right to inspect and right to cancel paragraph. And it's a really important paragraph in this contract, because if you look on line 251, let me see if I can get this highlighter even to let me highlight this. Nope, it's not working for me today. Okay, on line 251, over to the right, there's a sentence that starts that this is the most important sentence in this paragraph. If buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion, doesn't matter what I think, doesn't matter what you think, doesn't matter what the neighbors think, doesn't matter what the listing agent thinks. If buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion that the property is not acceptable to the buyer, buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice of such election to seller prior to expiration of the inspection period. So the truth of the matter is, with this as-is contract, during that inspection period, if the buyer just gets out of bed and says, you know what am I doing? Why are we buying this property? I don't even need to be, why can't I just be happy where I am? I need to get out of this contract. During that inspection period, they can walk. Oh, and if you have a buyer that ends up doing that, you do not have to explain the buyer. You do not owe a justification to the other agent. You simply get the release and cancellation signed by the buyer, indicating that the buyer's deposit is to go back to the buyer. Send it over, email it over to the listing agent with a message that says, buyer is electing to exercise their right to cancel per paragraph 12 of the contract. Release and cancellation form is attached. Please ask the seller to sign this form. That's all. And listing agents sometimes will call and go on and on about, well, I would just want to know why. I want to know why are they canceling? Because they can. Because they can, period. That's it. That's all there is to that. So you do not owe them an explanation. And if you provided one and you said it's because they don't like the way the street light hangs over the yard or whatever, it doesn't matter, you know, or that they want to live on the east side of the street, not the west side of the street or something. It doesn't matter. That this paragraph doesn't get into that at all. So just know that. So the seller, when you're on the seller side, even though you're under contract with this contract, the seller is in a vulnerable position through this inspection period, because the buyer potentially could get out of bed and cancel. So sometimes when we're on the seller side, we will tighten that inspection period and ask the buyer to make that a 10-day inspection period instead of 15. But remember, it's calendar days. The other thing I want to point out is with this contract, the entire inspection, negotiation, repair process has to be completed. So by the end of the inspection period, the inspections need to have happened. And oh, by the way, let me just digress and share with you, the inspector is just an inspector. If things need to be validated, it's best to get the licensed professionals out to verify it. The inspector says the air conditioning is not working properly. Let's get a licensed HVAC person out there. Sorry if you're hearing my dogs. They're somebody must have just come to the front door. I guess my husband will deal with it. So it could be that the roof, the inspector says there's no life left in the roof. Good for the inspector. Get a licensed roofer out there to look at it, licensed roofing contractor, and go by that, because the inspectors aren't always correct. But you need time for the inspection, for the licensed professionals to verify it, to make the request to the seller to make repairs, and to come to terms before the end of the inspection period. Because the buyer needs to, that inspection period is another pinnacle point. At the end of that inspection period, either buyer decides to proceed or decides to cancel. You have to come to terms by that day. So what you will find in version now, and I'm sure it's going to be in our new DocuSign system also, we have two forms for this particular contract. One is the as-is request for repairs form, and one is the agreement for repairs. So the request for repairs, actually towards the bottom of it, has a place where you can extend this inspection period by whatever number of days you think is necessary to finish getting through that process. So you send over your request for repairs, And at the bottom on that request form is a place where you can say, we would like to extend the inspection period by 3 days, 4 days, whatever, to allow time for investigation and determination of costs and agreement before that inspection period ends. So just know that that's another piece of the puzzle here as far as this inspection period is concerned. So just keep that in mind. And I had another thought about that I was going to share with you, Lana. Let's see if that'll come back to me now. Oh, I was going to just talk with you for a minute about home inspectors, and again reiterate, they're just inspectors. This was probably, probably 12 or 15 years ago. I had a listing on a little house over here in the Lellman area, and the inspector, I was out of town. I got a call from the buyer's agent saying buyer was going to cancel the contract. And I said, really, why is that? And they didn't have this where they could just cancel for any reason. Well, the inspector said the roof has no life left in it. It was a flat roof. And he believes it's not pitched properly. And so he has even written up in his report that he is willing, that the whole roof needs to be taken off, including the trusses. The trusses need to be replaced with a different angle on them, and the whole thing needs to be reconstructed. And he would be willing to come out stage by stage and inspect it as the work gets done. I was furious. Seller was furious. Buyer is walking away. So I called the home inspector and I said, can I just ask you a question, Mr. Home Inspector? Sure. I said, are you a general contractor? No, he said. I said, wow, that's interesting. Are you a licensed roofer? Roofing contractor? No. I said, wow. I said, well, I'm a little surprised to see that you would literally put in your report that you are of the opinion that this roof needs to be completely removed and replaced, and that you are willing to come out and inspect it stage by stage if you're not one of those licensed professionals. And he said, well, I was just doing it out of courtesy. He said, I realize, I'm not licensed to do all that. And I said, well, here's the thing. I'm not convinced we have that severe of a problem here. And I just want you to know, you have now created a situation where the buyer is very fearful about this house. And I'm disappointed to hear that. And so we ended up getting a roofer out there. The short story there is I got a licensed roofer out there, and there was one board that had a little damage to it. I don't know if it was from critters or if it was just rot or what. But anyway, the roofer said all they had to do was sister that board, which is where they put another board side by side with the board that's damaged and bolt it on and clamp it on, and it strengthens, puts the strength back in the board. So for like $300, the problem with the roof was fixed, and the licensed contractor wrote on his stationery with his license number and his insurance number on it that he saw no issue with the roof, that the one board that was added was sufficient to remedy the problem. And we moved forward and we did close on that house and we sold it. But I share that with you because every once in a while we meet, even still today, a home inspector who just forgets to stay in their lane, it seems like, and they get rather broad in their statements about the condition of a property. And I want you to remember, I don't get arrogant with them. I'm low key, soft toned and all. And yet I want you to remember their job is just to be an inspector. The people that validate whether the issue is really an issue are the licensed professionals. And so what I will say in front of an inspector, I only go to the home inspection at the very back end for the review now. And when I go there, I'll say to the buyers in front of the inspector, as he brings up issues, I'll say, so based on that information, we are probably going to need to get a licensed roofer out here to validate that issue and confirm that that's something needs to be addressed. And I'll say it repeatedly in front of them because I think they need to realize their job is to inspect. Up until the last few years, I have to tell you, in Florida, to be a home inspector, I was always told all you had to do was pay the fee to DBPR and you had a license. Now I think you have to take a class and take a test, and then you have a license. But you don't have to have a construction background. You don't have to know anything about housing particularly. I met one home inspector within the last couple of years who told me, because we got in conversation, at the end, he told me he had been a computer programmer and now he's a home inspector. So just know that, you know, before you just let a deal fall on the floor, get a licensed expert out there to give the buyer advice that's more more supportive. Let's just call it that. All right. So then we get down here to paragraph on line 263, the walkthrough inspection. I just want to remind you, this paragraph says on the day prior to closing or on the closing date prior to the time of closing, as specified by buyer or buyer's representative may perform a walkthrough and a follow-up walkthrough if necessary, inspection of the property solely to confirm all items of personal property are on the property and to verify that seller has maintained the property as required by the as-is maintenance requirement and has met all other contractual obligations. So the walkthrough is really important. And we just had a conversation in our team meeting about this today. I brought it up and it's come up a couple times in the last week. So I really want to emphasize the importance of having a final walkthrough form with you and getting that signed when you do the final walkthrough to serve as documentation in your file that absolutely the buyer did get one last chance to look at the property and one last chance to confirm that they were comfortable with it and satisfied with it before closing. After closing, when you don't have that, it's your word against theirs of whether you really did a walkthrough. So I encouraged a couple of newer agents this morning. I was talking with them and I said, just print out a couple of copies of the final walkthrough form, go out into version now and get print a couple copies there. And there is a waiver of final walkthrough form as well. Print a couple of them. And if your car is like mine, I have a pouch. I have a pouch on the back of my seat that I just stick a couple of them in there. So I have one. And so typically when I do a final walkthrough, I'm literally, as we go into the final walkthrough, going to bring that form in there with me. And even if they signed everything else electronically, I'm just going to ask them to sign it right there while we're right there at the property and just to help make sure that I get it. And Irene's comment that it's amazing that the issue could come up because of different financing. I know, I was shocked too, it blew my mind, but that's a true story. I'm here to tell you. I got the bruise to show for it. So make sure that you get that, do the final walkthrough inspection. And if an issue comes up, you know, notify the other agent and let them know that there's an issue that you found. Now, on the other hand, let me digress and say for final walkthrough, when you arrive on the property and it's time for the final walkthrough as the agent and you're there with the buyer, do not make it your job to go dig up issues on the property. That's not the time to do it. So typically, if I'm doing a final walkthrough, all I'm going to do is I'm going to say to the buyer, okay, this is last call now. This is your chance for you to walk around the property, take a look around, make sure that everything is still in the condition that you saw it before and as you expected it. And you are certainly welcome to test or verify anything that you would like to test or verify. And a lot of times they'll go like, so like what, Pam, what do you mean? And so I will say, I might walk over to the kitchen sink, for instance, and turn the water on. And I'll say, so for instance, let's see, do we still have hot water? Oh yeah, we still got hot water. So then I might say to them, well, is there anything else you'd like to verify and check? But I'm not, and they might, most of the time what they do is kind of look around and say, well, you know, I think it all looks pretty good. I think I'm good with it. Okay, great. If you're satisfied with it, then sign this form that we've done the final walkthrough and let's go to closing so we can make this your house. And off we go. So I share that with you because you don't want to start testing all the burners on the stove and, you know, testing the pool heater to see if it works and all of that. That's not the time to do all that. So in the chat box, I see here from Cassie, yeah. And don't wait until an hour before closing. Yes, absolutely. Good point. Because if there is an issue there, you know, sometimes the issues are issues that can be easily remedied, but there, you do need a little time to resolve it. Yeah, like Cassie says, and the washer and dryer are gone, or the good point about that, or the refrigerator, like I was talking about earlier. Or I've had times where, once that I can remember, we did the walkthrough the night before. I prefer to do it the day before when I can. The hot water heater was not working, and so we got a new hot water heater installed in the morning by the plumber before the afternoon closing. Sometimes there's issues with, you know, the nails not pulled out of the wall for the pictures that were hanging on the wall, or, you know, the buyer feels like the house hasn't been cleaned or whatever. But by the way, the contract really doesn't commit to that it will be spotless. So there's a limitation on that too. And then I see where Michelle said, is there anything we need to fill out if the buyer changes lenders, if they use a different lender than the pre-approval letter? No. Good question, Michelle. Thanks for asking that. But no, they can change lenders. That's okay. It's more, it's the contract, the language that we're reviewing is specific to the contract. And so as long as their terms are the same, meaning the amount that they borrow is the same and the type of loan program is the same, you're okay. You're okay with that. It's what stung me was the fact that they decided to finance 80% or something instead of 90%, or what, I don't remember the exact percentages now, but it was a different percent going down. And then I see where Alexander said, Pam, didn't you have a broken window on one right before closing? I did. Thank you for reminding me about that. I had forgotten. Yes. I had a house that I had the listing side. Sellers had moved out. They were moving to North Florida. That wasn't that long ago, Alexander. I forgot already. But they moved to North Florida, and buyers went over and did the final walkthrough the afternoon before. And I got a phone call from the buyer's agent saying the window, the front window, they had on these like big, not really picture windows. It would have been like a picture window, but they were individual panes. And one of them had a hole going through it, like it could have been a rock hit it or something. And yeah, just a minute, Scott. And so I ended up calling the seller and telling him we had that. And the seller said, there is no way. That's ridiculous. That buyers must have done that. That window was fine when we left. And I said, well, you know, we don't know. Maybe someone driving by, you know, hit a rock. I don't know where this hole came from, but we need to replace it. So yeah, I scrambled and I got a great company. If you ever need a glass company that came out and fixed that window, I was shocked. They came out kind of like the companies that do the cars. They came out with the sheets of glass on their truck and took that pane out, put another pane in, cut it right there on site, stuck it back in there, sealed it back up. And in like about an hour, we had a whole new window there, and it was sweet, I'm telling you. So Scott's asking, can he share a final walkthrough horror story? So go ahead, Scott, and share that with us real quick.
Yeah, I only bring it up just because, again, it's about kind of not really doing it too close to actual closing. I had an early morning closing about 5 or 6 years ago when we had that 2-week period where we had like 20 inches of rain in Tampa Bay.
Oh, yeah.
And so we did the walkthrough the night before or the evening before and found out that the seller had moved out, but he'd also turned off the AC system and left the windows cracked.
Oh.
So where the laminate flooring was, there was a giant bubble from where it had expanded. And when you walked in the bubble just moved around the room. And I was dealing with the buyer's side and had one of the giant teams in Tampa Bay here. And so each part of the transaction had a different person to contact, and I didn't know who to reach out to. So I actually contacted the broker through LinkedIn, and they had the negotiator call me back immediately. But I was going up until midnight that night trying to negotiate terms of what we were going to withhold and all that for flooring. So it's definitely good not to do it the hour before if it's something like that, but you know, you always have to be careful.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Good. And good advice on that, Scott. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. There was a situation. Ginger kind of shared the story recently. And I had a similar kind of situation myself where, sellers removed, in the situation I had, sellers removed their washer and dryer from their laundry room, and they had put laminate in the laundry room. Now, why someone would put wood laminate in a laundry room, I don't know. That's kind of beyond me, but they had, and they pulled out the washer and dryer, you know, disconnected the hoses, didn't think to turn the faucet part off for the washer and dryer. At the time, the water was already turned off, so they didn't think about it. And then buyers had the water turned on day of closing, and so the water got turned on while they were at closing. And after closing, they went over there, and water had poured out of that hose, all out of that faucet, all over that laundry room laminate floor, and it was one ugly mess. And so we ended up having to negotiate some money from the seller to cover that. So cover that cost. So go figure. All right. So moving right. So as you know, I've always thought, you know, it's not over till it's over, right? So don't go spend the money in the bank till you get all the way through the closing, because Lord knows things happen, right? All right. So paragraph on line 268 says, as far as seller's assistance and cooperation in closing out building permits, it says basically that the seller is willing to do that. But on the next page at the top, it does say on line 275, seller shall not be required to expend or become obligated to expend any money. So basically this says if buyer's inspection of the property identifies open or needed building permits, then seller should promptly deliver to buyer all plans, written documentation, et cetera, in seller's possession relating to the improvements, which are subject to such open or needed permits, and shall promptly cooperate in good faith with buyer's efforts to obtain estimates of repairs or other work necessary to resolve such permit issues. Seller's obligation to cooperate shall include seller's execution of necessary authorizations, consents, or other documents necessary for buyer to conduct inspections and have estimates of the work prepared. But in fulfilling such obligation, seller shall not be required to expend or become obligated to expend any money. And that's a little known truth in there, because buyer's agents tend to jump right all over the seller about, well, you know, we've got this open permit, the seller's going to have to close it before, you know, pay and get it done. But technically, not so much. Now, let me digress and say there's what I call the words on paper in the contract, and there's what people are willing to do. So remember, before you jump on the other agent who calls and says, we've got an open permit, we need the seller to help with it, and you jump on them and go, well, I'm telling you right now, the seller's not going to pay for it. The contract says they don't have to, and we're not doing it. Before you go there, say, do what your job is, which is to say, okay, let me talk with the seller about that and see if there's anything the seller can do to help with it. So if the seller is willing to pay to get that cleared, or willing to put the effort into getting that permit closed or whatever, it's okay. They can do that. So just know that sometimes as agents, we get in the way of the deal, and there's no need to get in the way of the deal. If the seller doesn't mind fixing it, you know, paying to have it addressed or whatever, then they can do that. It's not our money, it's their money. So just remember that. All right, so as we move on down, escrow agent talks about how the money is going to be managed. Paragraph 14, just a reminder, dadgummit, we're just a real estate agent. Shoot, we're not a tax person. We're not any kind of a construction person. We're not an environmental person. We're not an attorney. So we've got to kind of stay in our lane about things. And then paragraph 15 talks about how we're going to handle buyer default or seller default. And if you notice on line 325, if buyer fails, neglects, or refuses to perform buyer's obligations under this contract, including payment of the deposit within the time specified, seller may elect to recover and retain the deposit for the account of seller as agreed upon liquidated damages, consideration for execution of this contract, and in full settlement of any claims, whereupon buyer and seller shall be relieved of all further obligations under this contract. Or seller at seller's option may, pursuant to paragraph 16, proceed in equity to enforce seller's rights under this contract. The portion of the deposit, if any, paid to listing broker upon default by buyer shall be split equally between listing broker and cooperating broker. So, you know, the seller may choose to take the buyer's deposits, and if they do, that's considered to have satisfied any dispute. It certainly appears to me. So now we move into title and title commitment. And on line 374, remember, buyer shall have 5 days after receipt of the title commitment to look at it and notify the seller in writing if there's anything that makes the title unmarketable. And then this talks about how we cure that sort of thing if it comes up. Line 391, as far as the survey is concerned, title requires, pretty much title companies now require a survey because they insure, the title insurance policy addresses encroachments, and they rely on that survey to help them be assured that there aren't any buildings encroaching on the property. And you know, years ago when I was first in the business, I was helping my nephew buy a house, which he didn't get to buy, over in St. Pete. And the house next door, what we discovered like 2/3 of the way through the deal, the house next door, the front corner, the people had added on the front of their house, and about 18 inches of the front corner of that house was over the property line for the house that into the property that my nephew wanted to buy. And the houses were far enough apart that it would be hard to realize that if you did the work without a survey. And he wasn't able to buy it because we were told at that time that if he bought that property with the knowing full well that the neighbor's house was 18 inches, front corner was 18 inches over the property, effectively he accepted it and he would have no legal recourse to ever get that resolved. So we ended up going back to the seller. We suggested to the seller, asked the seller, would they consider helping to get the property replatted and move the property line over by like 3 feet to give 3 feet or 4 feet to the neighbor. My nephew was even willing to do that, and we could never come to terms on it. And so we just had to pass on the whole thing. You know, here again, paragraph D on line 401 talks about lease information and the fact that the seller is to deliver that lease documentation to the buyer, so that the buyer is aware not only of the lease, but also the monies that have been retained as deposits. So the seller at least 10 days prior to closing is to furnish estoppel letters from the tenants or occupants specifying the nature and duration of occupancy, the rental rates, the advanced rent and security deposits. And the seller is expected, I had a seller recently ask, do I have to give up the rent deposit that they gave me? Yes, you're transferring the tenant. And so you've been holding the tenant's money. It wasn't yours to spend. That was their deposit. So yes, you have to give that to the new owner. So yeah, I don't know what gets into people sometimes. Liens are going to be paid off. Paragraph 420, timeframes, calendar day shall be used in computing time periods. And just a reminder, on line 421, it says, other than time for acceptance and the effective date, any time periods provided for or dates specified in this contract, whether handwritten, typewritten, or whatever, which shall end or occur on a Saturday, Sunday, or national holiday, shall extend to 5 p.m. where the property is located of the next business day. So if you have a 10-day inspection period and it ends on Saturday, per this language right here, you actually have until 5 o'clock on Monday to finish resolving whatever you have to resolve for an inspection, for example. Force majeure, you know, is the whole storm thing, and that will extend time for that to recover and conduct business. So sometimes I get questions about line 442, the location. This paragraph does say that the closing will be conducted by the attorney or closing agent designated by the party paying for the owner's policy, and will take place in the county where the real property is located, at the office of the closing agent, or at such other location agreed to by the parties. Every once in a while I'll get a question about, well, this title company is in Orlando. Don't they have to close in our area? And the answer is yes, per the contract, unless everybody agrees to close some other way. But to close in our area doesn't mean they have to physically be here. They can send a mobile closer to handle it. It's okay. But the buyer and the seller, neither one is required to drive all the way to Orlando to do the closing, or Miami, or wherever the closing company might be. Prorations and credits, I think hopefully everybody understands that, but the seller typically is responsible for property taxes, for instance, from January 1st through the date of the closing. And then the buyer is going to ultimately have to pay the tax bill the property tax office is not going to bill each party that's owned the property throughout the year. So the seller is going to go ahead and give the buyer money in advance to pay the tax bill. So when the bill comes out, the buyer should have the money for it. And then paragraph L there at 489, access to the property to conduct inspections. The seller shall, upon reasonable notice, provide utility service and access to the property for appraisals and inspections, including a walkthrough. So here's another important thing for you to be reminded of. When you're, first of all, the seller is expected per this paragraph to keep the utility service available so buyer can do inspections. As you're approaching closing, man, it just makes a hot mess when the seller has the power and the water turned off the day before closing or the day of closing. So I tell the sellers, please do not turn the utilities off until the day after closing at least. And here's why. Duke Energy, I can't tell you how many times that sellers have arranged to have the power turned off the day of closing, and they show up at 7 o'clock in the morning and turn the power off. Now buyer can't do the walkthrough. They can't really verify that the air conditioning works or the hot water heater or, you know, a lot of other things. So encourage the seller to turn everything off effective the day after closing. Encourage the buyer to turn everything on in their name effective day of closing. And so then Duke Energy is just going to come out and read a meter, and they really aren't going to turn the power off at all. And same thing for the water, typically. Risk of loss, if there is a casualty, there are terms in here for how to work through the loss and proceed with the sale potentially. Somebody asked me recently, what's a 1031 exchange? On line 502, a 1031 exchange is an action that investors might take, in that there is a program in place that would allow investors to swap properties. So I might own 2 smaller properties and negotiate to swap them, effectively sell them and buy another property instead. And yet if an investor does that sort of thing, a fiduciary company, there are companies out there that handle 1031 exchanges. They have to manage that transition of the property and the swap of the property, because technically the investor owned the first 2 properties as an investment, and so the fiduciary company acts as the manager of their investment, just like managing their stock investment, only in this case it's an investment in real estate. Paragraph R there, 524, writer's addenda and typewritten or handwritten provisions supersede anything that was that's already printed. So that's where that's specified. And then on line 534, there's a whole paragraph about FERPTA. And I don't want to turn this into a FERPTA class, but what I will make you aware of is the last I checked, if the purchase price of the property that's owned by a foreign person is under $300,000, and maybe even at 300, I'm not positive about that. If the buyer is willing to sign an affidavit at closing to indicate that the buyer is planning to live on the property at least 50%, buyer or buyer's family, at least 50% of the time over the next 2 years, then the title company does not have to withhold income tax from the seller's proceeds. However, when and buyers do sign that, but when they do, technically they're taking on responsibility for those taxes. So if they were to move out, most of the time that's not their intention, but if they were to move out, technically they could be held responsible for the tax money, because the responsibility for that tax money shifts to their shoulders once they sign that affidavit. And for you, when you're looking for properties for a buyer, remember, when you see a listing that says seller is a foreign person, an investor can't buy that property usually, unless they put a really good amount of money on the table, because the seller, most of the time when it's a foreign seller, they're looking for a buyer that is willing to make it their residence and is willing to sign that affidavit. Not always, but the majority of the time they are. So whenever I find out it's a FERPTA property, I tend to think, oh, that property is going to be a better fit for somebody that's planning to live there. All right, coming down here to the end here, page 11. Take a look at paragraph X on line 562. So this as-is contract, this is like the bomb here. Buyer's waive of claims. To the extent permitted by law, buyer waives any claims against the seller and against any real estate licensee involved in the negotiation of this contract for any damage or defects pertaining to the physical condition of the property that may exist at closing and be subsequently discovered by the buyer or anyone claiming by, through, under, or against the buyer. So this basically says, Mr. Buyer, you're signing right now and you understand once you've closed, you're done. You're waiving your claims. And with the one provision there on line 566, it says this provision does not relieve seller's obligation to comply with paragraph 10J. And when we go back to 10J, that's disclosure, but let's just look at that really quick. Paragraph 10J. Seller knows of no facts materially affecting the value of the property which are not readily observable and which have not been disclosed to the buyer, except as provided for in the preceding sentence. Seller extends or intends no warranty or makes no representation of any type. So if they haven't disclosed, that is an issue that could carry forward. But aside from that, once the buyer has bought the property with this as-is contract, they bought it. Congratulations, you own it. The good, the bad, and the ugly. All right. So then in paragraph 19, what I want to point out here with these check boxes is it's important to check the check boxes, because literally this says the following additional terms are included in the attached addenda or riders and incorporated into this contract. So by checking it here, you make those riders part of the contract. So a couple of key riders, I'm sure you've heard it before, but just to help prevent risk of it being mistaken later, or missed later. Letter F, the appraisal contingency rider, is really, really important for a conventional mortgage. This contract doesn't have any language in it to protect a buyer if there's an issue with an appraisal on a conventional mortgage. It really doesn't. So if the property doesn't appraise, there's really not straightforward language that says buyer can get their deposit back. So you're going to want to add that appraisal contingency rider if they're getting a conventional mortgage. Make sure that you kind of cover their rear. And when you don't do it, and I've had agents say, well, you don't really need that. You know, if it doesn't appraise, the lender can just deny the loan. Well, yeah, but we're putting the lender in a really difficult integrity position when we do that. And here's why. Let's imagine that buyer has $500,000 in the bank. I mean, that buyer's got plenty of money, right? Here they are buying this $250,000 house, conventional, and it doesn't appraise. So now you pick up the phone and you call the loan officer and you go, listen, can you help me out here, man? Property didn't appraise. Can you just deny this loan? So now you're asking this loan officer, who knows full well this buyer has plenty of money and is financially able to buy the house, to write a letter saying, oh, this poor buyer can't buy this house. It didn't appraise. This is a problem. That puts that loan officer in a really difficult position when the truth of it is the buyer could buy the property. Buyer doesn't want to buy it because it didn't appraise. So do everybody a favor, do the right thing and add that appraisal contingency rider so you don't put that lender in that tough spot. And I've had some loan officers, you know, just flat out say they're not real comfortable doing it because buyer really could still buy. So know about that. There's another one here that I wanted to remember to bring up to you. Well, it's not on this contract, but if you were using the standard contract, letter L is the right to inspect and right to cancel rider. And just a reminder, if you write the standard contract, it doesn't have all that language we talked about the right to inspect and right to cancel, the fact that the if buyer and buyer's sole discretion is not comfortable with the property or satisfied with the property, they can cancel. That's not in the standard contract. And so buyer doesn't have that door to just walk away. So for the standard contract, you're going to want to remember to add that letter L rider. And then I'm gonna digress one more time here. And I know you've heard it, if you were in boot camp at all, you've heard me say, remember to double check for the difference between the condominium rider and the homeowners association rider. Make sure when you're dealing with those kind of properties, you know what kind of property it really is. So, and disregard what's on MLS. I just wrote an offer recently. The MLS all over the place said condominium, and it's not a condominium, it's a PUD. The property is a PUD. So the wrong disclosures were provided and everything. So here's your tip. As soon as you decide to write an offer, go to the property appraiser's website for the appropriate county and look at the property use code. If it's a condominium, it's going to say condominium, and then you'll know to use the condominium rider. You can also look at the legal description. If the word condo is in the legal description, typically, it's been my experience, it's a condo. If the property use code is planned unit development, or PUD for short, PUD, there's a homeowners association. Now, every once in a while, not very often, but every once in a while, we'll have a situation where there's a condominium association and a homeowners association. Five Towns right here in Pinellas County is a great example of that. That complex has, I don't know how many now, 16, 17, 18 buildings, I don't know. Each of those buildings has their own condominium association because each building really is a condo association. And yet the common area, the pool, the tennis courts, the recreation center and everything is owned by everybody across all the buildings. And they formed a homeowners association to manage all of that. So individuals that live in that complex, when we sell those properties, they get a condo rider and a homeowners association rider, and the buyers agree to pay two fees. They pay a monthly condo fee and a quarterly homeowners association fee. So occasionally that will come up where both are there, but I have never had a situation other than that sort of thing. Aside from that, they're either a condo or they're a homeowners association. And if there is one at all, and you can discover that from the property appraiser's website typically. So another tip here, since we've got a little bit more time, you probably heard this from Lisa, but if you're working with a buyer and they need to get a contribution from the seller for closing costs, remember paragraph 20 is the place to add that. And what you're going to put in there for additional terms, this is what I would recommend that you put in there. You're going to add seller agrees to contribute. I would put a blank if you're writing this down. Seller agrees to contribute. It's either going to be a percentage or a dollar amount, percent or dollar amount of purchase price towards buyer's closing costs to include allowable and non-allowable closing costs, comma, points, comma, prepaid items, and escrow items
that fast.
on closing. You want me to say? Okay, I'll say it slower. I'll say it slower. All right, here we go. Seller agrees to contribute. Seller agrees to contribute. Put a blank there. Either a percent or a dollar amount of purchase price toward buyer's closing costs. And I'll say it all again after this. Buyer's closing costs to include allowable and non-allowable closing costs, comma, points, comma, prepaid items, and escrow items upon closing. Let me say it again. Seller agrees to contribute blank dollar amount or percentage of purchase price toward buyer's closing costs to include allowable and non-allowable closing costs, comma, points, comma, prepaid items, and escrow items upon closing. Now, let me tell you why I put all of that in every time I need that, why I put all those words on paper. Probably 12 or 14 years ago, I don't remember. It was a long time ago. I wrote an offer and all I wrote in there for additional terms was seller agrees to contribute 3% or whatever it was, $3,000, whatever, toward buyer's closing costs, period. That's all I put. I was newer in the business and I thought that was enough. Well, guess what? We closed through an attorney's office and the attorney was representing the seller also, right? So we go to the closing, and back then we didn't get any of these disclosures ahead of time. You didn't get a copy of the HUD before you got to the closing table, right? It was all reviewed and finalized right there at the closing table. So it must have been like $5,000. I looked at that closing statement, and the closing statement showed the buyer was going to have to bring like $4,000 more than we had expected. And I'm sitting there trying to figure out, whoa, what happened here? How did this happen? And so then I realized that the attorney had only given like $1,000 towards the buyer's closing costs, not the $5,000 we had requested. And I said, excuse me, sir, that I thought the contract said $5,000 towards buyer's closing costs. Now he's shaking his finger at me. Young lady, he said, the contract as you wrote it said $5,000 towards buyer's closing costs. Buyer's closing costs only tally to the 1,000 or whatever it was. And I said, well, that wasn't what it was meant to say. That wasn't the intention. He said, I don't care what your intention was. I'm telling you, that's all that you put on paper. Like my heart sank. I was new in the business. I'm like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? So back then everybody gathered at a closing together, buyers and sellers. So I looked at the listing agent and I said, would you mind stepping out of the room with me? So we stepped outside and I said, listen, here's the deal. This buyer does not have $4,000 more. So we either need to figure out a way to help this attorney understand that, just like you and I understood from the beginning, that the seller was going to contribute $5,000, and he needs to allow that to be applied to the prepaid items and the escrow items and the points. We need that, or we all need to go just pack up our stuff and leave because we can't close today. So the listing agent went back in, talked to the seller, and the seller authorized for the attorney to change that, and we closed. Whew, because that was scary for a while. My heart was pounding. I'm telling you right now, I was like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? So after that, I went back and talked to a loan officer, and he said, as a newbie, and he said, Pam, really, you should be putting all this language in there. And let me just tell you something. Anytime I ask for closing cost money, all those words go on that paper. And I've never had an issue with it before, but that was, we thankfully at Keller Williams, we don't mind sharing stories like that to help prevent it being an issue for others in our group. But that was a scary moment for me because I didn't have $4,000 to give that buyer. Let me just tell you right now, at that time, I did not. All right. So then, of course, on the next page, everybody signs. I don't ever fool with getting the address in there. Just remember, if you're on the buyer side, you're the cooperating sales associate there on line 616, and the cooperating broker is going to be the name of your office, Keller Williams Gulfside Realty, Keller Williams Tampa Properties, or Keller Williams Realty for Clearwater. And then you can, when you write an offer, you can go ahead and put in the name of the listing agent and the name of their firm, and that's okay. And then the trick on this contract is just remember to get all the pages initialed, including this page. This page wins the award for the most missed because the buyer's going to sign on this page and the seller signs on this page. So it's easy to think you forget that they also have to initial, but you need it initialed also. And then one last thing I want to go back and remind you about in today's market. And then if you've got a question, we've got 5 or 10 or about 10 minutes or something, I can answer a question. I use this other box here on this group of checklists at the end here over to the right, you see other. And I often these days am using the Keller Williams escalation addendum. And if you're not familiar with that, it's a great tool for competing in today's market. It really is. So it's a tool where you can indicate, it's a form that's out in version now, and it's the escalation addendum. And with it, you can say, buyer's initial offer is $250, for example. Buyer agrees to pay $1,000 more or $500, whatever the increment is, $1,000 more than the highest offer received by the seller, up to $255,000 or whatever the limit is that the buyer's willing to contribute. And I will tell you, on several occasions, the buyer and I have won the bid in multiple offers because we included that clause. Because
It was me
unfortunately,
twice.
was
Twice
it?
it-
Good for you.
Yep, twice. I just had one a month and a half ago, and we used that clause and we got it, and there was 7 offers on the table.
Oh my goodness, that's great. That
Yeah.
is really great. Now, of course,
But then the
remember,
house didn't appraise.
oh, well, you had it locked down by this. So did you still close?
No, we ended up because it wouldn't have, it came in $40,000 low, and I thank God I put the appraisal contingency in there because she did have the money to pay for it.
Oh, wow.
40,000 is a big, huge difference, but
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
it works. I've used it twice.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Irene's asking which clause. So it's the, if you look out in version now, it's the Keller-Williams escalation addendum. So, and we call it the escalation clause. So the challenge in this multiple offer world is it's not like going to an auction. It's not like going to an auction. So it's not like you're sitting there and one buyer says, well, I'll give you $250 for it. Well, I'll give you $251. Well, I'll give you $253. And so the bandying back and forth and changing price doesn't happen. So, you know, when we say tell the buyer to put their highest and best offer on the table, the buyer doesn't know what they're competing against like you would in a true bidding auction bid situation. So one way to kind of jump ahead of that a little bit is to use that escalation clause. And so it does give you the opportunity to say, well, the buyer's willing to pay $1,000 more than whatever everybody else is willing to pay. Now, keep in mind, the seller still is not obligated to take the offer just because it's the highest offer. Sellers can choose to take an offer for any dadgum reason they want to. Sometimes it's because a buyer's willing to give them a longer time to close. Sometimes it's because they happen to see the family that came through their house and they really wanted their house to be filled with children again. And the one party that came through had 2 small children and they liked the energy or whatever. So, you know, sellers, it's just interesting what sellers choose to do sometimes. All right, so we've got, you know, about 10 or 15 minutes here. So let me just ask, is there anyone that's got another question? Is there anything else we can help you with here regarding contracts? And, you know, was this helpful? Was it helpful for you? Yeah.
Very much.
Okay, good.
Yeah, Pam, I really, you know, kind of like my ahas on this was to like the special assessments. It's like I've never had that issue. I've always said sellers will pay, but I've
Yeah.
never had that issue, thankfully, because I never really realized it was municipal only on that versus HOA, COA sort of things. And then also about your explanation on the buyers canceling in paragraph 12.
Yeah.
Usually, if it's been during a because of a home inspection, then usually the listing agent's wanting to see the home inspection report to show why. So that's something.
Yeah,
great.
you don't owe that to them, and that's a
Right.
real important lesson. You don't owe them that information at all. You're not obligated. So you can say they just want to exercise their right. And sometimes listing agents, and remember, we're all, you know, at the end of the day, we're human beings, and you never know at what point for that listing agent, that's standing between them and paying their mortgage payment this month. I mean, that's real world, right? So I understand their reaction sometimes. But there are times when I've sent a cancellation over and the listing agent has come back and said, whoa. I mean, like, so what are we canceling over here? Like, right, just tell me. I mean, if we need GFCI outlets, just say so and we'll get GFCI outlets, right? And sometimes it's not that at all. It doesn't have anything to do with that. Buyer just is like, what are we doing? This is not what we want. You know, I don't even know. I've had them say to me, you know what, Pam, I don't even know why we even asked you to show us this house, because it is so not what we said we wanted. I got a buyer right now, I'm gonna tell you, I'm going to a home inspection to hear the review at 5:30 today after doing this. And this young man, first time home buyer, I've shown him multiple condos and houses that he said he loved because he has a family. He's a single guy, but he has family members and all. And he liked the idea that they could look out have a backyard, and he liked having the screen patio, and he could see himself barbecuing with them and all. Well, you know what we're under contract on? A condo that's in a complex where I've never ever seen them before. This is the first time I'd ever been in one like this. I've lived in this county all my life, but in this particular condo complex, the building has 2 condos back to back on each level. So on the first floor, you go into his condo, there is no backyard at all. His back wall is the back wall to the other condo that faces the other side of the building. The only patio or area he has for outdoors is a screened patio on the front. And when he was looking at it and said, you know what, I like this place. I want to make an offer on it. He's a young man. And I said, well, you know, I'm happy to write an offer. I just want to point out to you an observation, if you don't mind. When we've looked at all these other properties, the thing I heard you say the most that you liked was being able to look out in the backyard and the screen patio and the barbecues. And I don't see that here. Do you? And he said, oh, you know what? I don't think it matters that much. So, so we're under contract on this condo. It doesn't match what his behavior was at all. So it's going to be very interesting when we go back this afternoon for this inspection review. I'm not wishing to have the deal fall apart, but it wouldn't surprise me at all for him to have thought about that, or for him to come back today and look at it and go, what am I doing? What am I doing? Because I walked away thinking, what is he doing? Right? And we wouldn't know anybody an explanation. So, you know, at the end of the day, what I love about this business, absolutely love it, is that it's totally an adventure. Every trip and every deal is a whole new thing. And it's all about people. And as people, we're as different as night and day. And our outlook and our expectations are as different as night and day. And in different stages of our life, you know, our preferences change. And so it's just fun. It's just absolutely fun. And really what they should have told us all when we went to real estate school is before you can be a real estate agent, you need to take a psychology class, or 2 or 3. That's where we should have started. Yep. So anyway, with that, I see one other something here in the chat. Let me see what that is. Oh, thank you very much that you appreciated it. Thank you, Irene. My pleasure. I really enjoy sharing the stories, and I will tell you, part of the reason why I enjoy it so much is when I got into the business in the beginning, if it wasn't for the other seasoned agents that were patient enough, even when they were busier than dadgum, you know, to stop and help me, I'm just ever so grateful, because in hindsight, when I look back, I don't know that I would have had the wherewithal to keep pushing forward, because there was so much. I felt for a long time, I felt like there was more that I didn't know than there was that I did know. And so I'm very grateful that they would share their experience, because I have yet to find the book that would tell you all this. I don't think it's out there, not at all. So with that, I just want to say I wish you all the best, and there's plenty of opportunity, COVID or no COVID, there's plenty of opportunity to help buyers and sellers. And at the end of the day, they need your help, because I cringe every time I work a deal with an agent that I know clearly hasn't had much training, and their professionalism is much down on the bottom end of a scale that I would measure. And so, you know, go be the professional that you are and make a difference in people's lives, because that's what we're here for. All righty. Oh, one more little chat.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
My
Pam.
pleasure. Have a good evening. And I'll
You
let you
too.
know that when you run into me in the hall, ask me if the guy with the condo ended up with a backyard or not.
Yeah, good
Yeah.
luck today.
I'll ask you on Huddle tomorrow morning.
Yeah,
There
good
you go,
luck.
Scott. I'll let you know. All right.
All
We'll
right,
talk
thank
soon.
you.
Bye.
Bye.